No one, not even you, definitely not me, drifts towards health. That's what Tony Morgan said. I heard him say that recently. I follow him, listen to him. He's kind of a church consultant, but has had a lot of jobs in the marketplace. And he said this quote basically as he was talking about businesses or churches. You don't just, hope to end up in a healthy organization or a healthy business or a healthy church. He says no one drifts towards health. Do you know what I drift towards? Cookies. Right? Maybe some milk to go with it. I mean, that is like, do you know where I drift? Towards the buffet line for the second, third time. And that's where I drift. Do you know where I don't drift? I don't drift towards the gym. I drive by the gym. I live very close to the gym we have a membership of, and for whatever reason over the past month, life's happened. I cut grass now, so that counts. I just haven't been to the gym recently, and did you know that 67% of gym memberships go completely unused? No one drifts towards health, and that applies to all kinds of health, right? And especially in where we're going to go today, this idea applies to relational health and spiritual health. No one ends up where they want to be just because you want to be there. That's not how this happens. This quote makes me think, okay, there's some effort that needs to be, kind of put into this to be able to have a healthy relationship or a healthy relationship with God or any kind of health. There has to be some sort of intentional decisions that are made. Now think about the Mississippi River. The Mississippi River flows slower than you can walk, okay? So 2,340 miles, from Minnesota to the Gulf of Mexico. It flows slower than you can walk. It takes 3 months for the water in Minnesota to get to the Gulf. And it moves slower than you can walk. And here is what happens to us. Without even realizing it, we drift. We drift. We might not even see it. We drift. We drift downstream. Without the right intentional decisions, the stream very slowly, you almost can't even tell, pushes us downstream. And just because you or I want to be closer to God or have a healthy relationship with God, the sobering truth is it doesn't mean you will. It doesn't mean you will, because you drift and I drift toward what you and I allow. That's the sobering reality. No one ends up in a healthy relationship or has a healthy spiritual relationship with God by drifting toward it. What happens? We end up where we allow ourselves to end up. What does this mean? This means that we are responsible for the direction of our relationships, especially the direction of our relationship with God. And sometimes we drift towards what we actually want more. And that's why we allow it. And so there's some responsibility here. But there is something that we're up against here. It's the current. All of us face currents on our spiritual journey and in our life journey, right? And you can't remove them. They're there. There's nothing you can't, imagine a life where there's not currents coming against you. And these currents, they make it difficult because staying close to Jesus is difficult. Following Jesus the way you want to follow Jesus is difficult. There are two kinds of currents I want to talk about. The first one is the external currents that we face in life. These are everything on the outside, right? It's the push, the pace of life. It's the constant pressure we feel to buy this, keep up with this, read this, look at this, participate in this. And after all, I mean, money needs managed, so we need to be kind of involved there, and the kids need educated, so we need to spend some time there, and we have to go to work, and that takes up a lot of time. And then we're met with the waves and the push of culture. There's these external currents that sometimes, if we're not careful, can move us downstream away from the kind of relationship with God that we say we desire. And then there's the internal pull. So anything inside of you, there's things inside of you that come from within you, like your desires, the things you really want. Or maybe you get flooded with emotions, or you have dreams, or dare I say lusts, that pull you. They pull you away from the path of God. They pull you downstream. Now, we've been in this series, and we've called this series At a Distance. And what we're doing is every week, we are talking about one thing that contributes to the distance that may exist between you and God. And if you wanted to, how do you get close again? We've already discussed that decisions create distance. Reckless decisions create distance, and you get back to God by making one decision at a time over time. Last week, we discussed how sometimes distance is disguised. You look close. Everything's great on the outside, but inside, there's self-righteousness. And we have to expose that disguise, and we have to get a clear view of who God is and who we actually are. Or today, maybe, you've drifted. Have you drifted with the currents, the pulls, and the pushes of life? Is this why you're distant? Because slowly, as you go to work, as the demands keep coming down, as you meet your needs and pursue your wants, is it possible that you're drifting? That you're drifting from a heavenly Father that you want a relationship with. And along the way, you've been ignoring the warning signs. You've justified your inattention. You know that you might be drifting, but you're dismissing. Or maybe you've harbored this internal private attitude of, oh, I'm fine. I'll be fine. I'll turn it around when I'm ready to, when I want to. I'll just turn this ship around, and we'll get headed in the right direction. And now in 2015, there was a U.S. cargo ship called the El Faro, and it was sailing, in the Atlantic Ocean close to the Bahamas. And these reports started coming in that there might be some pretty intense weather that was going to hit the ship, and the weather in terms of a hurricane might be heading in their direction. And so the captain goes to the bridge, he gets the report, and he, hey, what do you think? What do you think? What do you think? And he says, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to make a minor course change. We're going to make some early decisions here. And then he left the bridge, and there they go. Meanwhile, while he was making those decisions, there was two people on the bridge who wanted to speak up and say, I don't know if that's good enough for the risks that we have here. This weather report we got is kind of outdated, but nonetheless, they didn't speak up. The captain declined more requests and urges to change course, and he didn't. And so what ended up happening is that this ship went into some pretty tumultuous waters. And flooding started happening in the ship, and it started getting into the cargo. What kind of cargo was this carrying? Cars. So the cars started going, back and forth, and eventually they hit the emergency pump that would pump water out whenever the ship is getting flooded. And so that's a problem. And now, obviously the captain's back trying to figure out how do we get this thing going in the right direction, and then they lose their propulsion ability. And instead of mustering the crew to go solve the problem, he sort of hopes that it will regain its ability to propel. And it didn't. And so this cargo ship sank. All because of poor decisions in the wrong direction and a private attitude of, we'll be fine. And once you lose propulsion, the ability to move in the currents. Once you lose it, you are now only at the mercy and the will of the currents around you. Now, hear me when I say this. No one sets out to sink a ship, just like no one sets out to sink their lives. You don't set out to shipwreck your marriage. And most people that I know don't aim to shipwreck their faith and their close relationship with God. What happens? You drift. You drift. And we drift. And listen to the warning that the writer of Hebrews gives the Christians who were, by all accounts, drifting, or at least considering turning away from Jesus, because following Jesus in the culture was getting hard because they were being persecuted. So Hebrews 2:1, here's what the writer says. He says, therefore, because of who God is, we must pay closer attention to what we have heard, lest we drift away from it. Now, the word closer, it can carry the idea of with care, being careful, and very much carrying the idea in this, the picture that comes to mind is as you're bringing a ship near, as you're docking a ship, be careful, because, by the way, one of the top reasons why ships sink is a failure to dock correctly. And so when you're coming close, when you're moving through the currents, exercise care as you're bringing near. And not only do you need to have closer attention, but the writer says you need to pay, which means that it's going to require something from you. It's going to require something from me. You don't just float in to dock, You've got to pay attention. You've got to be there. You've got to know when to propel and when to turn and all those kinds of things. And what I see over and over, far too much, in people's lives is propulsion failure. Propulsion failure. People want to be close. They want to be close to God. They want a great marriage. They want better relationships. They want better spiritual health. They want to get it right with their kids. You want to be able to say no to temptation, but what do? In the currents of life, we allow ourselves to drift away from our desired destination. And then we finally realize it when it's too late. We finally realize it when we're caught. We've been cheating financially. We've been cheating on our taxes. And then you don't really turn it around until you get slapped. Or maybe for you, it was, I want a divorce. And that finally got your attention, We let everything just drift until something wakes us up. Now, no one who wants to be close to God intends to get distant. What happens? They drift. And what I see over and over is people don't know how to propel out of that situation. They don't know how to fire, the engines to lead them out of distance into the place where they want to be. And so how do you keep yourself from drifting from the relationship with God that you want? And maybe you have drifted. How do you get close to God? Again, what is going to be our propulsion strategy in the currents of life and the wayward pull of our souls so that we don't drift or that we can fight the drift that we've already experienced? And today I want us to meet 10 men. And these 10 men, through these 10 men and their story, we're going to discover 3 different types of fuel that can propel us against drift. So open up to Luke chapter 17, and we're going to start in verse 11. Now on his way, speaking of Jesus, to Jerusalem, Jesus traveled along the border between Samaria and Galilee. Okay, so where is Jesus? Jesus is on his way, maybe a couple of months out from Jerusalem, the final trip to Jerusalem, and he's along the border of Samaria and Galilee. He's on the outskirts of this village, okay? Now, where he's at, if you were like a really good Jew, you would consider this kind of a distant from God place. Samaria, they had some mixed up views. Galilee, well, they weren't educated. And likely you would have thought that, okay, where Jesus is at is kind of distant from God anyway. And so here they are. In verse 12, as he was going into a village, 10 men who had leprosy met him. Now I'm going to need your help when we read this last sentence. They stood, here we go, at a distance. Now he meets these 10 lepers who have a skin condition. And because they have a skin condition, maybe they're different skin conditions, maybe it's all the same. They've sort of connected with each other because they were not allowed to be in community. They were pushed out of community because they were viewed as contagious. Maybe they were, maybe they weren't. So they were separated to live outside the camp. Here's what this means. These 10 men were cut off from their families, from work, and from life. Not only that, they had to wear clothes that signified, hey, keep your distance. I've got an issue. Don't get too close. And if you got too close, what did they have to do? They had to shout, unclean, unclean, so somebody wouldn't get too close to them. They were distant. They didn't choose distance. They had to be distant. They had to be distant. In fact, some rabbis were reported to say that this distance that you needed to keep from, someone that had leprosy was at least 16 and a half feet or 100 paces somewhere in there. That's how close you could get to these men. So here they are. Imagine this, alone, unclean, and distant. They couldn't even get within 16 feet of their wife or their husband or whoever. That's the kind of place they were. So what do? They hear that Jesus is coming by. They know who Jesus is. They've heard what Jesus can do. And so in verse 13, they called out in a loud voice, Jesus, Master, have pity on us. Distant. Not because they chose, but because they had to be. Distant from community, distant from God therein. This is the first fuel. What they do is the first fuel you need to propel you close again. Here's what it is. They ask for help. They ask for help. What are they doing? They're admitting that they're distant. And maybe what you need to do, and maybe what I need to do when we recognize that we're outside, that we're distant, that we've drifted away, we need to admit it. And then once we realize, oh my goodness, I'm far away from where I want to be, we need to ask for help. And not just anyone for help, we need to ask Jesus for help. What are they doing here? They're issuing a desperate plea for mercy. They knew what they wanted. They wanted healed so they could get back to their families and get back to their lives. They wanted this distance removed. And they knew what Jesus could do. More importantly, they knew where they were and they knew what was causing it. They knew what was causing the distance. My question to you is, do you know what's causing your distance? And when you know, what do? You ask Jesus for help. Heal me. Fix me. Like whatever you need to ask him, you just say, I need help. I want to be close. I've drifted and now I want to be brought back in. You ask for help. Verse 14, when he saw them, he said, go show yourselves to the priests. And as they went, so fascinating. And as they went, they were cleansed. As they went, they were cleansed. Jesus tells them as they ask for healing, he says, go and show yourself to the priest, which would have go into the city, find your local priest. Why did he tell them to do this? Well, because this is what the law said. Go read it for yourself, Leviticus 13 and 14. If something cleared up on their skin, they thought they were well, they would have to go show themselves to the priest. The priest would inspect them. if this in fact did clear up. And then guess what? There would be 8 days of rituals and sacrifices that included shaving and washing and more camping before they would be allowed to get close again, to resume life. They had to do 8 days of these rituals before they could see their wife again, before they could go back to work or see their kids. How did they get healthy? How did they remove the thing that caused distance? They've asked for help, but here, this is so important. They trust in Jesus' words. They trust in Jesus' words. This is the second fuel that will propel you as you fight the currents and the pulls of life that ultimately lead us to drift. And it was as they went. So in other words, they weren't healed until they started moving in the direction of healing. That's when they received what they asked for. So they had to step toward what they wanted through faith. They had to start to live and behave as if what they were asking for was true. Now, some of us, we don't see spiritual healing. We can't turn the chapter on this, spiritual rut that we're in. We can't move close again because we're not taking a step of trust. It's as you go, as you go, as you go. We don't know how many steps these lepers had to take before the transformation happened. But one thing I do know, and one thing you can count on is the only thing that will propel you out of distance with God is asking in and acting on faith. This is the only thing that will move you back into the direction of the life that you intended, the relationship with God that you want and have identified would be very important to you. And my guess, if you feel like you've drifted or you're drifting, if you're distant because of drift, my guess is because you've stopped trusting. You stop trusting as you go to work, as you go to the doctor, as you go to that next family thing. You've stopped trusting that God is with you through all of that. The life and marriage and school and work, you know God, but you're not trusting him. In fact, what's actually happening is the currents of life are sweeping you downstream. And maybe more clear is the pull within. You're actually, as you go, more interested in money, success, sex, and experience. And not all the things that you're interested in are necessarily bad, but you are moving in that direction because of something within. Now hear this. When we drift from faith, we drift from God. The moment that you and I stop trusting God as we go through life is the moment that you begin to drift. How are you going to course correct this? How are you going to get back on track with your relationship with God? By trusting in the words of Jesus. All you need to do is to open up his word and follow it. So many of us have the first part down. We can open it up, but then to actually apply it, that's going to be the game changer for you. That's going to be the moment you begin to experience the potential of transformation and healing and get you back on course. Let me give it to you another way. If you're struggling with distance between you and God and you want to get close to God, maybe for the first time, maybe again, here's what you need to do. You need to open Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John and read about Jesus. And every single time you hear Jesus tell you to do something, what do? You do it. That's how you get close again. That's how you fight drift. Now, there's one last fuel that prevents drift. And only one of these lepers does this. And it's the one thing that I think that many of us lack. And here's what it is. Luke 17, 15 through 19. One of them, when he saw that he was healed, when he saw that Jesus had healed him after trusting in his words, he came back praising God in a loud voice. He threw himself at Jesus' feet and he thanked him. And by the way, he was a Samaritan, which means of all the people who were distant, likely the other 9 were Jews, would have been considered closer to God. They all were kind of from or around that, distant village. This guy was the most distant. And here he is coming back, praising Jesus. Jesus asked him, were not all 10 cleansed? Where are the other 9? Has no one returned to give praise to God except this foreigner? Then he said to him, rise and go. Your faith has made you well. This is the only person of the 10 that Jesus says your faith has made you well. Something more is happening than just a physical healing to this man. And you have to notice this because you can miss this. This is why this is significant. And this is why the other 9 we wouldn't really, get upset at. Instead of beginning the 8-day process, which is what Jesus tells them to go do, to get back on with life so they can see their family, get back to work, pursue their dreams. Instead, because that's a long road that these 9 guys have to go to. And they're like, we got to get a jump on that. We still got 8 days ahead of us before we can resume life. This guy decides to delay that so that he could go and see Jesus. What does he do? He delays so he can praise. And this is what you and I lack sometimes. We want to get on with life. We want a relationship with God and we want all the blessings of God, but we've got stuff to do. So give me what I need and let's go, But here's this guy. Jesus didn't ask him to come back. He was moved to come back. What is this? This is worship. This is worship. I like Andy Stanley's definition for worship in Visioneering, a book that he wrote. It is worship is recognizing and responding appropriately to the greatness of God. This man comes back and in a loud voice, he's praising God. The word for loud is where we get our word for megaphone. Like he has to be loud because of what God has done for him. When was the last time you threw yourself at the feet of God, appropriately responding to what he's done in you and recognizing who he is before you? See, when you see people in your life and you look on at them and you go, wow, they seem to trust God. Like, do you know people like that where you just go, man, nothing moves them, or they never seem to drift. And you might think to yourself, how do I get that? I really, really want that. Well, let me just tell you what they do. This is their fuel. Are you ready? They put themselves in positions and places to worship God. That's their secret. They're not so focused on going through life. They have time to recognize and respond appropriately to this great God. And so what do you need to do? You need to put yourself in positions and places to worship, because if you don't, you will drift. You will drift. You need some fuel to help you fight the currents of life and the inward pulls of the soul. Something happens in us. Something happens in us when we worship and thank Jesus for what he's done, but we're hoping he will do. And more than this particular leper wants the healing, he sees the healer and he wants him more. He wants him more. Now, the writer warns the Jewish Christians that we talked about earlier in the book of Hebrews of drift. And particularly, he warns them of what could happen if they stop gathering to worship or if they stop worshiping in general. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 21 and following says, since we have a great priest over the house of God, what do we need to do? That's Jesus, by the way. What do we need to do? Let us draw near with a sincere heart, near to God with a sincere heart and with the full assurance that faith brings, having our hearts sprinkled to cleanse us from a guilty conscience and having our bodies washed with pure water. Let us hold unswervingly, not be impacted by the currents of life or the pulls of our soul to the hope we profess for he who promised is faithful. Let us consider how we may spur one another on toward love and good deeds, not giving up meeting together, as some are in the habit of doing, but encouraging one another. You see, the writer is writing to these Hebrew Christians, and here's the reality. Gathering together was risky. Corporate worship was a real risk because they were being persecuted, thrown in jail, and murdered. And so if you thought you had an excuse to miss, a gathering, you don't. These guys were like, and gals were like, I could die if I go today, or it could change my life forever if I go today. And the writer says, even though there's great risk in gathering, it's worth the risk. You and I, we risk missing a nice weather day to come to church, They're risking their very lives to gather. And yet the writer's like, it's worth the risk. It's worth the risk. This is so important. When we drift from faith, we drift from God. I'm sure you probably would agree with that, but maybe you've never thought about this next one. When we drift from times of worship, we drift from faith. We drift from faith. See, worship is what can propel you to fight the external currents and the internal pulls. So what do you need if you want to be close to God, or you want to stay close to God, or you want to foster this close relationship and fight drift? What do you need? You need a rhythm. You need a rhythm of worship and gratitude. Of worship and gratitude. That's what you need. You need to be able to regularly come before Jesus. Not be so anxious about getting on with life that you forget about the author of life and the one who can equip you and arm you to fight the currents of life and the pulls of the soul. Ephesians 2:13 says this, I love this, but now in Christ Jesus, you who were once far away, your own decisions or indecisions has caused you to drift. Although you were once far away, you've been brought near by the blood of Christ. All of us were once so far away. We couldn't get close to God if we wanted to. And now we can get close to God anytime we want to. And we have to understand that closeness wasn't free. No, Jesus did something so dear for you, it cost him everything. Think about this. Jesus paid the price to bring you close. And doesn't that just mean the world to you? Isn't that everything to you? The grace and the love of Jesus? Like, he sacrificed everything to us, and we can't even give him an hour? 10 minutes? And let me get this clear. He doesn't need your hour. You do. And so much more to fight the pulls and the currents. And I wish you could know, there are people every Sunday who wish they could be here, but they physically can't. And they would give anything. I wish you would know these people. All throughout my years in ministry, there are people who want to be in a gathering because they need it so badly, but something is preventing them from being here, and it's legit. And they can't be here. And I love looking at their faces when they're able to come because they're having a good health day or whatever, and you just can't imagine what's going on in their souls. It's life-giving. It's life-giving. So we need 3 rhythms of worship that is going to help you prevent the current from pulling you downstream. The first one is this: worship first. Worship first. These are what's going to propel you upstream, away from where you want to go to where you want to go. When is this? When is this kind of worship? Well, it's first. It's first. Here's what you have to do. You have to believe it's best to worship first. What am I talking about? I'm talking about the first day of the week. This is what's most important to you. What am I talking about? The first part of your day, recognizing and responding to the one who has given you everything, is the most important. The first part of your income, if you're a follower of Jesus, this shows that you trust and you worship and you're thankful. The first thing on your calendar is worship. The nine lepers, they were healed. They had what they asked for, but they were heading back to life. And I wonder if they missed such an important moment. Listen for deception as you try to worship first. Because here's what it sounds like. It's fine if I skip. I'm not risking my family if we don't, go to church this Sunday. I'm not risking my faith if I just, life group, not this week. I'm not risking my marriage. Yeah, we'll go to church every once in a while. You may not be in danger now, but here's what this is. This is drift. It's the beginning of drift. Worship first. Worship frequently. Worship frequently. Where is this? This is both personal worship and public worship. And you need both. You need regular rhythms where you worship God personally. Nobody else around. You're on your knees and you're worshiping God. When was the last time you took time to worship God when nobody else organized it? If you want to get close to God, all he says is, come near to me. Come near to me. I've heard this story too many times, okay? You need personal worship, but I've heard this story. I don't need church to have a relationship with Jesus. I can do that on my own. I can have my own Bible study. The church is messy and full of hypocrites, and I'm busy anyway, and I'm just going to work it on my schedule. And let me just say this very politely to you. You can't follow Jesus alone. You need to be served. You can't just have personal worship moments and be good. Because you need to be spurred on by others. You need to be served by others. I've also heard this side. I don't have time. I don't have time to do stuff personally. I'll go to church and, that's a nice little thing and they do everything at once for my whole family and that's great. But I don't have time to do this personally, I have time to pray or to read scripture for 10 minutes a day or whatever. I don't have time for that during the week. Life's too busy. But hey, I'll make it a deal to be here on Sunday and it works really, really well. And let me just, again, caution you. Jesus never says, attend me. What does he say? He says, follow me. And even more closely, as we watch this leper, worship me. Worship me. Put me first every day and frequently. This will fuel you as you go, as you fight the pulls from within. And then finally, worship fully. Worship fully. What is this? What is full worship? What do I mean by this? Well, you partake, so you receive, you let others serve you, and you participate. You receive encouragement. You receive messages like this one that give you clarity and direction and inspiration and all that. And you're served, but you also participate. You serve others. Worship isn't, like this consumption moment, right? Where we go, let me get me what I need so I can, go out there and do what I need to do. No, it's not about consuming only. It's about contributing to. How do you contribute? Using your gifts, your resources to serve others. There's something you miss if you only consume. There's something only God can do if you put yourself in his position and say, you know what, I'm not just going to attend church, I'm going to serve the church because I know how important that is to me. Maybe you need to do that today. Maybe that's a step you need to take. But what I know we need to do is we need to shred this consumer mindset that somehow okay, God, I'm going to church, or I'm opening my Bible, or I'm going to pray, and you have something I want, and what's the lowest cost on me to get that? God, what our relationship is becoming is very transactional. I'm here, you do for me, and we're good. And let me just tell you, that is not worship. That is not worship, and you will pull away from the Father. Jesus isn't a product to make your life better. He's the way and the truth and the life. What do you need to do to get close to God, or to stay close, to fight the currents and to prevent drift? You need a rhythm of worship and gratitude. A rhythm of worship and gratitude. Why? Because the currents are slow but steady, and the pulls within, they're quite strong. You need to be able to ask for help. That's why you need a rhythm of worship. You need to be able to trust as you go. And you need the fuel of regular, first, and frequent, and full worship, and what that will do to propel you against the currents of this life. So let's draw near to the one who has power to propel us forward collectively. Come on. I don't just want what you give me. I don't just want your healing. I want you most, God, first and forever and frequently. Hey, hear me. Even if you have drifted, even if you don't feel worthy to worship, he wants you still. He has brought you close, and he loves you most. He is worthy. He is king. You can trust him as you go through life. And we need him. And we need to be in his presence. And we need to proclaim his holiness and his goodness and his righteousness. It does something in us that it's irreplaceable and it's not transactional. So would you stand with me? Let's spend some time worshiping our Heavenly Father.